Welcome to the Theological Family Ministry Podcast, a podcast for parents as well as children and youth ministry leaders. We are dedicated to showing how theological study and biblical application relate to the discipleship of children and youth. As always, we're hosted by Pastor Ben Palaz, the pastor of family and children's discipleship at Curtis Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and Tony Trusoni, the family and student pastor at Faith Family Church in Finksburg, Maryland.
Hey Ben, how you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Doing well. We're gearing up for Valentine's Day as we record this podcast in just a couple weeks, and when people hear this podcast, it'll be even sooner than that. And for me, it's such a busy time of the year because I have our oldest's birthday, and then we have Christmas, and then we have New Year's, and then we have our anniversary the day after New Year's, and then Danielle's birthday, and then a month later, Valentine's Day. So it's a busy month of getting things for my ladies. My little guy, not as much around that time of year. But do you guys have big plans for Valentine's Day, you think?
Well, we're going to have a marriage dinner date night at our church the Saturday after that, so it's the day after. But Tiffany and I have never really been Valentine. I mean, we've never gone out on Valentine's Day the whole time we've known each other. Not to say that we've never done anything for Valentine's Day. We didn't want to wait in line for restaurants and deal with all that. And so we've always kind of done it off-peak time. So nothing too extraordinary, at least at this point.
Yeah, I get that. So, I don't want to blow our budget either. So we'll figure something chill. But, with February, we think of love. We also think of the great achievements of African Americans in American history, which is great. One thing we often aren't aware of and conscious of in February is that for many, especially those who had love, who had a Valentine but no longer have it, Valentine's, the month of February in general and the days around Valentine's can be particularly hard. Actually, on a show I watch, Parks and Recreation, we watch it all the time, and one of the characters early on, she has this kind of Valentine's alternative for her and some girlfriends who have kind of lost love, that had loved somebody, but then they aren't in relationships, and it's called Galentines. But not everyone even has Galentines. So I want to talk today, even though it's the month of quote-unquote love, about actual divorce. And what do you think it would be hard on Valentine's Day to be divorced?
I would think so, particularly if it was, I guess, maybe given some years and maybe not so much, but I would guess so. Yeah,
absolutely. So, well, with the topic of divorce, how do you think divorce is portrayed in America in the year 2020, which is weird to say 2020?
It does. It's hard getting – it just seems so different than – you get 2018, 2019. That's not as much. But when you flip the decade like that, I think that a lot of people would say, it's not overly desirable. Sometimes things just don't work out. Sometimes it's just inevitable. And so it's not treated it's certainly different than it was in generations past in our country or other places where Christianity has taken root, or even other just traditional cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that kind of provoked me wanting to do this podcast actually was something about how it's portrayed. Actually, there's an Oscar-nominated film this year that some people think the best actor will come from, and it's called Marriage Story. It was from late 2019. It was actually a Netflix film. Have you seen it?
I've not, but I have actually heard of it. You'd be surprised. And I read a little bit about it. So that's as far as I got.
So I did watch it, and it was interesting, and it's being seen as kind of a great commentary on the nature of divorce. In A Marriage Story, it portrays divorce as super painful, and it actually it portrays the ways that it divides even those that have fallen out of love and creates them into enemies of one another. But the funny thing is I think it became unrealistic in that it had all this, disaster happens, but at the end it just kind of all works out. They didn't explain how it all works out, but it just kind of, they're just cool with each other at the end after completely destroying one another in court and stuff like that. But I think it does display both the idealism of divorce sometimes in America in 2020, as well as the reality of it. And I think the reality of divorce is that it's seen today as unfortunate. I don't think anybody really wants it. In fact, I think for that reason, marriage rate and that less people are getting married and less people are getting divorced is even more so. But I also think it's seen as kind of normal, as not really not scandalous, but just a normal part of some marriages after things don't work out as planned.
Yeah, I think that's a good take.
And you mentioned, with divorce being more common in some parts of the world as opposed to others. Why is divorce so prevalent in the Western world, Ben?
Well, we have rampant individualism. I think that's part of it. I don't think it's the only cause. We also have been heavily influenced by these romantic ideals, seeing love. We've come to see it as a contract or as a means to personal fulfillment. And so when I'm in love with this person, I'm going to be feel happiest. And really the biggest thing is for me to feel fulfilled. And if I'm not, then, well, I need to make steps to correct that. Now, I think this is one of those chicken and egg things, but just depictions in popular culture and in the media, music, kinds of things. Now, it's hard to say which one came first, but they're probably feeding on each other. But you can often see it portrayed, how love itself is portrayed. And so then that would give, even though maybe the movies and music aren't outright saying, hey, you should get a divorce, those maybe sometimes they do. It's feeding into that false notion of what love is and what marriage is about, and that it's being used to do something it's not designed entirely for. Not to say that it is not, there's some level of personal fulfillment, enjoyment, and these kinds of things, but that's not the primary thing that it's for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing to add to that is I think in the Western world, this is more prevalent also because there's kind of just a financial ability to more easily divorce.
Yeah.
And I've actually read some studies in showing that when economic development happens and when people have, plenty, they're more likely to divorce because it's actually a possibility that's within reach in that kind of way. But I think what you said is really on that spot on. But one thing it is super important to note in our panicky podcast about divorce, which is not panicky, is that it is in fact actually on a slight downswing. Compared
I've
to
read that.
Yeah, many years. Compared to, I think I've read in some things that it's heading to levels lower than in most of my parents' life, and so that doesn't say that it's not high compared to the rest of the world. It still is astronomically high, but it does seem to be on a slight downturn.
It does, and among educated, higher earning people, they tend to stay married longer. Whereas people who are not as high on the social economic scale, they are either just not getting married. That's one of the reasons that divorce rates are down. The marriage rates are also down too. But if less people are getting divorced, that is a good thing. Yeah. Though there's complicated reasons.
Well, and I think for listeners to note, though, with those kind of things, when you think about divorce rates going down, we're not talking about, divorce rates splitting in half. We're talking like a 10% decrease in divorce rates and something along those lines, for the record. So, And how do you think the church compares to the broader world in terms of divorce?
I remember hearing as a kid that it was at least 1 out of 2, if not even a little higher in the church. Now, I have since read that is inaccurate. At least, as people have investigated further, and among active conservative Protestants, there are a lot who attend church, that kind of thing. They're a lot less likely to get divorced than those who maybe even say that they're Christians, but who really have no meaningful involvement in a church. And it's kind of with just other religious people who are active in their faith that they tend to divorce at lower rates. But people who are just sort of nominal, they do divorce at higher rates.
Yeah, Absolutely. I've found similar things. And it actually is really hard to give a really specific detail on this because the government doesn't ask you what your strong religious statement is when you file for divorce. And there are states that, like California, doesn't keep a lot of divorce statistics, actually. But something I've seen consistently from the best evidence are that general Christians, like those who just claim to be Christians, that those that kind of check the box on a government survey that I'm a Christian, have about a 51% divorce rate, and that doesn't mean 51% get divorced, because people that get divorced once are more likely to get divorced a second time. That means about 51% of marriages in those cases end in divorce. And one thing that is fascinating is that we do know that the supposedly Christian South, the Bible Belt, has the most divorces per capita by significant measure compared to the rest of the country. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, pretty noticeably higher. So
I'm actually surprised that, just the kids that I know of in our church, we have, off the top of my head, I can think of some kids who come from divorced homes, but I'm surprised that we don't have more.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that's the case actually is because despite that being the case, born-again active churchgoers who received premarital counseling are thought to have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, divorce rate in America. And I've seen several things that study that specific demographic and show. It's unbelievably low. It's shockingly low into the single digits. Some stats even show low single digits among those who are born again active churchgoers who received premarital counseling.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, and I've do premarital counseling myself, and just hearing from people who got married without it and then are talking to their own kids who are getting ready to be married and things, and going, yes, this is a really good idea. You should do that. So
absolutely.
It's telling.
But what does the Bible say about divorce in general, Ben?
Well, most generally, God hates it. But there's nuance to it. Jeremiah 3:8, I'm sure there's a lot of explanation that could go into this passage, but there God is talking about Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and he says that he sent them away with a certificate of divorce. But Judah took no notice of it. But he also has compassion. He brings his people back from captivity and puts them back in the land, and ultimately makes a new covenant. But he did permit for divorce, or kind of regulated how it was done under the old covenant. It wasn't just a freewheeling kind of thing. There were restrictions. Jesus said it was because of the hardness of their and our heart, just as humans, fallen humans. I guess that's the general picture.
Yeah. So I think you got a lot of what I was thinking about. But one idea that came to my mind in thinking about divorce from scriptural lens is I really see in the Bible a marriage is kind of covenantal. And so breaking it can be a big deal.
Yeah.
And so some passages that really stuck out to me when Jesus spoke of the importance of really a strong and staying together marriage. He said in Matthew 19:6, the Bible reads, "So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." God joins together in marriage, and so it's a problem when it's separated in that way. Actually, Romans uses a lot of the idea of marriage as a demonstration of the gospel as well as the law. And it kind of, in Romans 7, he's talking about the law. And he said, "For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage." So that's a general principle out of marriage that he's using then as a typology. But the point is that you're bound for life. That's what marriage is ideally supposed to be. And you mentioned even where God says in Malachi that he hates divorce. And further, I think is relevant with this. You brought up how God pulls back that call to divorce, but I think further supports that is Romans 8:38 through 39, and I think it's thinking through this context of God's covenant love towards us. It says, "For I am sure that neither death nor life nor angels nor rulers nor things present nor things to come